Okay, hello everybody. So what I'm going to do right now is kind of walk through an admittedly extremely cooked up example of when one might use or want to use multiple class inheritance, why you can't use it in C#, and sort of go through what you can use as a workaround to remedy the situation in C#. So I'm going to kind of explain the situation, and I'll upload this entire project, because it's got quite a number of files in it, to the Canvas website, so that you can sort of peek through it yourself, go through it at your own pace. So what I've got here is I've got a program class. This is sort of the driver class that's going to let me walk through the whole example. I've got a sports and schools base class that I'm going to use as my derived class. I've got two interfaces. One of them is called iSchools. One of them is called iSports. This is the naming convention that you can expect inside of C#. It's the same in most languages. Any interface is going to have a capital I at the beginning of it, and then that name is going to be carried over into the classes that actually implement the interface. So I've got an iSchools interface. That interface requires that implementing classes have a list or a void method that lists out some names of schools. And I've got an iSports interface that requires its implementing classes to list out some sports. So what I have two dummy classes. These are going to be basically the parent classes, one for schools, one for sports. Each of these things implements the interface that you would expect it to implement. I'm going to make this public, actually. Because they implement these interfaces, they are required to have these void list school method and the void list sports methods. So for example, if I comment this out and I save, I'll now get this error that I am not abiding by the contract that this interface requires. And so in order to fix that, I have to implement this this specific method member. So IntelliSense will let me implement the interface automatically. And so by default, it will put a throw not implemented exception in here. But this is useful if you're trying to implement an interface that is maybe a system interface, or just an interface that somebody else created. You don't necessarily know all of the components of it. This very quickly lets you generate all of the code that you need in order to actually abide by the contract that the interface requires. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to go back to my implementation, and we're good. So at the end of the day, what we want is we want something like a sports and schools derived class that does something like inherits from both the schools and the sports parent classes. And so what that would do is it would allow my sports and schools derived class to actually print both a list of schools and a list of sports without actually having any content or implementation of its own. It would just steal the implementation of its relevant listing method or void method to, it would delegate that to whatever its parent was. So I can't do this, and I'm going to make this public too, just in case. I can't do this here, and actually the error specifically tells you that the class cannot have multiple base classes, schools, and sports, and so this is the explicit disallow of multiple class inheritance inside of C#. So out of the box, the best thing that I can do is I can have schools, and if I choose to have schools in my program or driver class, I can create a new sports and schools object called driver, and I can call the list schools method on this instance or this object, and if I run that, you will actually see a list of schools. These are the 3 schools that I've been associated with in my life, even though the sports and schools method itself does not have an implementation. So that implementation is actually taken directly from the parent, which is schools. So the hierarchy of things is that schools is required to have this method implementation because it implements this interface. And what we really want is we want sports and schools to be able to have both a list of schools and a list of sports without implementing its own. So what is the workaround? Well, the workaround is first to actually implement the interfaces instead of the classes. So if I implement I schools and I implement I sports, you will notice that this is giving me an error, but the error is that I'm not implementing the interface. And if I go and I use IntelliSense, this is allowed. So I am allowed to have multiple interfaces implemented by the same derived class. I am not allowed to have multiple parent classes. And so this is totally fine. And now what has happened is my derived class is required to have these two implementations. The problem is that I want these implementations to be taken from the parent and not the actual derived class. So it turns out that there is no clean, sort of easy way of doing this without having some basic implementation inside of the derived class, which is kind of unfortunate. It's sort of the way the world works. So in order to sort of remedy the situation from the caller's perspective and not necessarily your perspective as the person developing this derived class, what you can do is you can make a backing field of the type of both of the parent classes that you want. So you can have a public type of schools, call it schools, make it capital because it's public, or actually you can make it private. It's even a better. Make it private, schools, name it schools, and a private sports, and name it sports. And what we can do is inside of each of these things, I can actually use the schools dot list schools method. And here I can use the sports dot list sports method. And what I have done is I have hidden the fact that this class is actually implementing interfaces instead of deriving its behavior from the relevant base classes. And so this is very kind of roundabout, but it gets the job done. And what is the job? Well, the job is making sure that the interfaces of the parents are implemented. And so that is true. We do have a list schools, and we do have a list sports method. And the parents' behavior is expressed by the derived class. And that is also true because here I am using explicit calls to the parents' base methods in the child or the derived classes methods. So here I could override this by modifying the list of schools before I printed it, or any number of different things, just as I could if I was trying to actually actively override a virtual method on a parent or a base class. So if you are in a situation where you need multiple class inheritance, what you're ultimately trying to do is you're trying to make sure that the derived class has a contract that matches all of the parent class's sort of method and type contracts. And you're trying to express its parent's behavior, and this workaround does both of those things. It checks both of the boxes. It is not quite as succinct as one might hope, but it does allow you to support multiple inheritance in cases where you really need it. And so I wanted to walk through this because it's a little bit hard to discuss or walk through in a PowerPoint slide. It's much easier to actually show you. And I think once you get your hands on the zipped up project file, you'll kind of immediately see what's going on. It, in my mind, kind of reads as a cheap trick, but sometimes cheap tricks are what you need in order to get through a situation. So thanks for being part of this kind of short code along. The next code along is going to be more substantial, and we're actually going to try to use object orientation in order to build a really kind of rudimentary task management system. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.